All right, today we're putting on our detective hats. We're on a mission to solve a historical mystery, and our main clue is one of the world's greatest stories, the ancient Indian epic, the Mahabharata. We're going to use this epic tale to unlock the secrets of what society was really like back then, everything from family drama to the social ladders that defined people's lives. So that brings us to the big question, right? Can a 2,000-year-old story about a massive family feud really tell us how people lived, what they cared about, and how their world worked? Well, the answer is a huge yes, but it's not straightforward. It's kind of like a giant, fascinating puzzle. And when I say giant, I mean giant. Just to give you an idea, the Mahabharata has over 100,000 verses. That makes it one of the longest poems ever written, period. And that sheer size is what makes it such a goldmine for historians. But it also makes it super complex and, honestly, sometimes a bit contradictory. Okay, so let's start unpacking this puzzle. First off, how do historians even deal with a text like this? Well, they don't just read it as a story. For them, it's more like a window into the social rules and, more importantly, the realities of India over this incredibly long period, from about 600 BCE to 600 CE. It's our lens for seeing a society in motion. And this right here is the key that unlocks the whole thing. The Mahabharata wasn't written by one person at one time. Nope. It was told, retold, written down, and added to for over 1,000 years. And that layered process is exactly why it's packed with so many different viewpoints and social codes, all jumbled together. So to get our bearings, let's start with the official rules. You know, the way things were supposed to be. The epic actually contains big sections that lay out the ideal code of conduct. A lot of these ideas come from other texts called the Dharma Shastras, which are basically the ancient handbooks on sacred law and social duty. At the absolute core of the ideal family was this one big idea, patrilineal. It's simple, really. Everything, your identity, your wealth, your right to rule, passed from father to son. In fact, the entire central conflict of the Mahabharata, this massive war, is basically a huge, violent argument over this one principle. Who is the rightful male heir? Marriage, as you can imagine, was also full of rules. The ideal was something called exogamy. You had to marry outside your own kin group. This was defined by your gotra, which was like a clan name tracing back to a common ancestor. When a woman married, she was expected to give up her father's gotra and take her husband's. And for fathers, giving a daughter away in marriage, or kanyadana, was seen as a super important religious duty. Now, moving beyond the family, the whole of society was meant to be organized into this very rigid social ladder. This was called the Varna system. And the crucial thing to get here is that this wasn't seen as just a social thing. It was presented as a divine order, something set in stone by the gods themselves. So how do you make a social order seem divine? You tell a powerful story about it. A famous hymn explains that the four social classes were born from the body of a cosmic primeval man. The Brahmana, the priest, came from his mouth. The Shudra, the laborer, came from his feet. See how that works? It literally bakes the hierarchy into the very fabric of creation. And that ladder was crystal clear. At the very top, you had the Brahmanas, the priests and teachers. Right below them, the Kshatriyas, the warriors and kings. Then came the Vaishyas, the farmers, merchants, the economic engine, if you will. And at the bottom were the Shudras, whose job was to serve the other three. And believe it or not, there were even people considered outside and below this system, folks like the Chandalas, who were deemed untouchable. Okay, so we've got the official rulebook all laid out. Patrilineal, strict marriage norms, a four-tiered society created by the gods. Sounds neat and tidy. But here's where a detective story gets really juicy. Because when historians start looking at other evidence, like inscriptions or even just reading the Mahabharata closely, they find people bending, ignoring, and just plain breaking these rules all the time. Let's start with who could be king. The rulebook says loud and clear, only Kshatriyas. But reality? So much messier. You had major rulers, like the Shangas, who were actually Brahmanas. And then you had powerful kings like the Shakas, who were considered mlechas, or outsiders. So what does that tell us? It tells us that real political power was often up for grabs for anyone who could build support, no matter what the rulebook said about their birth. And it was the same deal with marriage. Remember that rule about women having to take their husband's gatra? Well, we have inscriptions from powerful Satavahana queens who did the exact opposite. They proudly kept their father's names. And get this, instead of marrying outside their kin, they often practiced endogamy, marrying within their kin group. That was a direct challenge to the Brahmanical ideal. And you don't even have to look outside the epic for proof. I mean, look at the heroes of the story. The 5 Pandava brothers are good guys, all share one wife, Draupadi. This practice, polyandry, was totally outside the Brahmanical norm. The fact that the central heroes of the story do this is a massive clue that social life was way more diverse than any simple rulebook would have you believe.
So what about all the people who just didn't fit into those 4 neat boxes? I'm talking about people who lived in forests, or nomadic herders, or skilled craftspeople. Where do they fit in? Well, their stories are in the epic too, usually on the sidelines, but they reveal a whole other side of this ancient world.
There's one story in particular that's just unforgettable. It's about a young man, Ekalavya, from a forest-dwelling community. He was a brilliant archer, a natural talent, but the great teacher Drona refused to train him because of his low birth. Later, Drona demands Ekalavya's right thumb as payment. And why? To make sure his royal student Arjuna would stay number 1. It's a brutal, heartbreaking story that shows just how that hierarchy was enforced. But it wasn't always about conflict. Check out this quote from Hidimba. She's a Rakshasi, a kind of supernatural forest dweller, and she's declaring her love for the Pandava prince Bhima. Their marriage is an amazing example of these different worlds, the mainstream and the marginal, not just clashing, but actually coming together and creating new families and new realities. So, in reality, the social map was much more detailed than just 4 Varnas. There were hundreds of other groups, often based on occupation, known as jatis. And these groups, like goldsmiths or carpenters, could band together into powerful guilds called shrenis. We even have an inscription that tells us about a guild of silk weavers who got so wealthy and respected that they pulled their money and built a beautiful temple. That's a level of social mobility the simple Varna system doesn't really account for. Okay, let's step back. On one hand, we have the official rules. On the other, we have all these examples of people living totally different lives. So what gives? How do we solve the central puzzle? Why does the Mahabharata contain both sides of the story? Well, the answer lies in how the epic was made. It started as stories told out loud by bards, maybe even on battlefields. Then, over centuries, Brahmanas started writing it all down, shaping it. Later, as the god Krishna became more popular, his story got woven in. And finally, huge sections about social rules were added. It's like a city that's been built and rebuilt over 1,000 years, with each generation adding a new layer. So here's the bottom line. The Mahabharata isn't a single tidy rulebook. It's the record of a long, messy, and fascinating conversation, sometimes an outright argument, between the dominant official ideas and the many, many other local customs and real-life practices that refuse to disappear. And what's really cool is that this conversation is still going on today. In a famous episode, our heroes escape a fire trap by letting an innocent forest woman and her 5 sons die in their place. In the original text, they're barely even mentioned, but a brilliant modern writer, Mahashweta Devi, rewrote the story from their perspective, giving a voice to these forgotten victims. It shows that the Mahabharata isn't a dead text, it's alive, and we're still arguing with it. So, what's the big takeaway from our investigation? It's that ancient texts like the Mahabharata aren't perfect photographs of the past. There's something way more interesting. They're a recording of a society grappling with itself, its ideals, its messy realities, and all the fascinating contradictions that lie in between. And that leaves us with one final thought. If a single text can contain so many competing voices and hidden stories, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other perspectives, what other silenced voices are still waiting to be discovered in our oldest, most sacred texts? It's a powerful reminder that history is never a closed book.